Hello and welcome to the Breeders' Cup webinar with Randy Moss. I'm Mike Hogan, Director of Product Marketing here at the Daily Racing Forum, and it's my pleasure to introduce Randy Moss, creator of the Moss Pace Figures and horse racing analyst for ESPN and NBC. Welcome, Randy.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
So today we're going to go over really whatever races you want to focus in on for the Breeders' Cup card, both on Friday and Saturday, but particularly look at them from the perspective of using your Moss Pace Figures to try and either figure out what the pace scenario is going to be in some of those races, glean an edge based on a horse that either ran sneaky well last time or was maybe a little pace compromised and perhaps in a better spot this time, and really just talk about the Breeders' Cup card as you see it playing out, both from a pace handicapper perspective but also from a general handicapper perspective. We will also have time to go over some user questions if anybody has them. To submit them, use the upper portion of your screen. The webinar channel allows you to submit questions. Those will be passed through to me, and I will ask them to Randy, often throughout the broadcast discussion, but certainly at the end, if there's any that we haven't covered and we have enough time, we'll go over them at that point. So, Randy, while I pull up the race card for Friday, why don't you explain, folks, and I'm using DRF Formulator, what I'll do is show people how to access those pace figures in Formulator, but maybe give a brief overview of what your Moss Pace Figures are and how and where to use them.
Yeah, what pace figures are designed to do is pretty much exactly the same thing that your conventional speed figures, like the Bayer speed figures, are designed to do. You know, when you look at a horse on paper in DRF past performances and you see that he ran 7 furlongs in 124, it's difficult to determine exactly how good of a race that was unless you know how fast the surface was, unless you know how fast that particular racetrack's 7 furlong races generally run, things like that, and that's what the Bayer speed figure can tell you. Pace figures are exactly the same for the fractional times. It incorporates run-up distances before the timing beam is actually triggered, which can be dramatically different at different distances at different tracks. It takes into account configuration situations at some racetracks that can make fractional time slower at some distances than others. So instead of trying to decipher fractional times and compare them from track to track, you can look at the pace figures and get a handy number to compare the two, also taking into account, of course, the speed of the racetrack surface. It really greatly simplifies the process of trying to figure out how fast a pace is going to be and trying to figure out who is likely to set that pace.
Yeah, exactly. And because, as you mentioned, there's so many other factors, including things like run-up and other things that you aren't necessarily going to see immediately by looking, you know, like you said, how fast the surface is playing on a given day versus a different surface on another day. What your figures do is they take a look, and essentially same way the Bayer speed figures do it for the final running of the race. They look at different portions throughout the race, both the leader and the particular horse that you're looking at in the past performances, how fast they were running at certain portions of the race. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, it gives you the performance of the individual horse and how fast he was running, and it also gives you the race shape. It tells you how fast the pace setters in that particular race itself were running, comparable to par, comparable to how fast you would expect a race of that nature to run. So you can look at the race shape and get a quick feel for whether the race was extremely fast-paced and likely to set up for a come from behind her, or vice versa.
Perfect. Well, let's start actually with on Friday. We've got 4 races in primarily, I should also note, the Moss pace figures are available for most races run in North America on dirt or synthetic surfaces.
On dirt.
Certainly on
exactly.
Right. Certainly on the larger tracks. You do have the figures available for Woodbine, and some of the synthetic ones are certainly the old Keeneland track. If you're going back far enough in the past performances, but yeah, they're mostly for use on dirt, and currently don't exist on the turf. So you'll see, we're looking at the dirt mile right now on my screen, and you'll see a horse like Redvine, whose last 6 races were on the dirt. You'll see Moss pace figures for each of those races, and then the prior races were on the turf, so you don't see the Moss pace lines. And on the left side, the race shape is showing how fast the leader and at the final one, the winner, went, and the plus or minus is, as Randy mentioned, the above or below the expected par for that day or for that pace. And then under the PPs and running lines of the actual horse, you'll see the numbers run for that individual horse, where if they were the leader and winner, these numbers will match. In the case of Redvine, where he was never in the lead in the first 3 points of call, his numbers are going to vary from what the leader set. And Randy, why don't we start with, I know I want to give you an opportunity to talk about whichever races you find most interesting and useful, but in the dirt mile especially, I think there are a lot of people from a handicapping standpoint that see Liam's Map as having not just a huge class edge, but a huge pace edge as well. How can you use your figures to either validate that assumption or to maybe poke some holes in it?
Well, I don't think you can really poke holes into the thought that Liam's Map is going to be the pace setter in this race. I mean, that's pretty much given by looking at the pace figures, and also looking at even if you didn't have pace figures, just looking at the horse's typical running styles. I mean, he's a tremendously fast horse. And you also have to take into account in these situations jockey intent as well. Liam's Map is such a fast horse that the riders of the other horses in the field that have some speed know that they're not going to be able to run with Liam's Map and still be around at the finish. So you'll see them typically ride their horses in a little bit different fashion. Now, when you look at Liam's Map's past performances, and you look at the pace figures, you see like the race shapes of the races that he set the pace. Most of them throughout his racing career have been extremely fast compared to par. Last start in the Woodward was not. He was actually running a slower than par pace when he was the only early speed and the controlling early speed. So that's probably going to be a little bit more in line with what the dirt mile is going to look like, even though last year, for example, Golden Sense and the year before was pretty supersonic out of the gate. Just run as fast as you can for as far as you can. Liam's Map is a little bit more controllable than Golden Sense was the last couple of years. And so I don't think you're going to see him be a complete runaway, but he is definitely not only the horse to beat, but the almost slam dunk clear leader in the field.
I see. All right. Well, I was. It's funny you say that, because I was almost trying to make a case that Mr. Z with Joe Bravo aboard tries to get the early lead just to his outside. But you're right. Aside from maybe the Preakness where he didn't even get the lead, Mr. Z's pace figures early, at least, don't match what Liam's Map has been capable of in the past.
No, and again, you've also got the jockey intent there. Joe Bravo, of course, is a guy who's known for hustling horses early. And Mr. Z is positioned also just to the outside of Liam's Map. If Mr. Z was inside of Liam's Map, I think the way those things usually work, you might see Joe Bravo maybe try to work a little bit harder to keep Mr. Z in front of Liam's Map. But I think what the strategy is going to be here is to position Mr. Z, a couple of lengths behind Liam's Map, length and a half, 2 lengths behind him, and to his outside, and try to relax him just off the pace there. But there's some other speed in there as well. I mean, you got, Valid to the outside typically shows a little bit of speed. Bradister typically shows a little bit of speed. So you're going to have 3 or 4 horses up in the first flight, but Liam's Map should be in front.
All right. Well, let's take a look at some of the other races, either on Friday or Saturday. Do you want to just go through the card and maybe skipping the juvenile turf races, since your pace figures aren't going to be available for most of those? You want to jump to the distaff and talk top pace scenario there?
Yeah, we can do that. There's not a lot of early speed actually in the distaff compared to what we might ordinarily see. And for those people who are maybe haven't been on the internet today, Untappable is now out of the Breeders' Cup distaff.
Right.
Untappable had a little setback. I think she had a fever, so she is now she's now out of the race, which doesn't really change a lot from a pace perspective.
Right.
We had Calamity Kate from post position number 5 and My Sweet Addiction from post position number 6, as well as Wedding Toast, are the horses that figure to have the most early speed. And of those, I think Wedding Toast is probably, the way I see it, your more likely pace setter. But, and she also would be probably, I think, the horse to beat in there based on speed figures. Yahilwa is another horse that is typically forwardly placed. So I guess there's maybe a little more speed in the race, and I'd give it a credit for when I put it at first glance. But
right.
But Wedding Toast is a horse that if you go back and you look at her most recent races, her last couple are a little bit of an anomaly because they were short fields, 6-horse fields at Belmont Park, 1 turn, mile and a 16th, 1 turn, mile and an 1/8, and there was very little early speed against her in either of those races. So those races shape up from a pace figure perspective as much slower than she is capable of running. So you can't really look at those, I think, and get a line on how fast Wedding Toast is. She's a lot faster than those particular pace figures would indicate. Calamity Kate ran a much faster than par race last time out in the Cotillion.
Right.
So there's every possibility with Edgar Prado from post position number 5, looking at the pace figures, that Calamity Kate might actually try to get the jump on Wedding Toast early. And since Calamity Kate's a 30-to-1 long shot, that might be the strategy as they figure out their best chance of pulling the upset, is maybe getting the jump on Wedding Toast if she gets a good break from the gate.
Right, yeah, the whole fastest horse from the inside angle.
And when you look at speed figures, though, they don't really, they don't really tell you that Calamity Kate is a prime contender. But keep in mind, she did duel for the lead in pretty fast fractions for Park Racing last time in the Cotillion, and still held on to finish second behind I'm a Chatterbox. So when you're looking for value, if you've got 30-to-1 on Calamity Kate, as opposed to 9-to-5, 2-to-1, 3-to-1 on Wedding Toast, and you can think that perhaps Calamity Kate could be hustled and could get a clear early lead, and maybe they'll leave her alone just like they do occasionally, thinking that she can't hold on. There's a chance that Calamity Kate could run pretty well at a big price and might be a really good value play just based on pace figures in there.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, there are certainly crazier ideas than using Calamity Kate in a spot like this, especially what seems to be an improving 3-year-old filly late in the year. Her as you mentioned, her last race in the Cotillion and even the race before in the Delaware Oaks, where she wired the field at a huge price, are 2 best races of her career. And you get an improving 3-year-old filly at this time of year. They can often run the best race of their life.
Now, the pace figure people will also look at the number 10, Yahilwa, and they'll say, wow, I mean, some of her pace figures and some of the race shapes are really strong. Last time out at Keeneland, she was fast early in the Spinster. She ran well in the Fleur-de-Lis, ran well in the DuPont in terms of pace. But from post position number 10, for jockey James Graham to actually get to the lead and get over and clear the field, he would really have to send Yahilwa early. And when you look at the way the horses line up in the starting gate post position wise, I think it makes it more likely that Calamity Kate would make the lead in this spot than it would Yahilwa.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think Yahil was one that I find a little interesting at a relatively big price. And one of the things I like about Yahil is the effort last out in the Spinster that you mentioned, where she set a pretty strong early lead, dueling with Lovely Maria, put that one away, and then took on Untappable and was not quite able to hold off. Got lucky late, but she's shown both two back in the Clemental Hirsch. Running against Beholder and running a clear second to Beholder, certainly no shame in that. And the race at Hawthorne, she's shown some ability to rate a little bit and to pass horses late, and I like that versatility, especially as you mentioned, perhaps out in the 10 post, at the risk of being marooned out there.
Yeah, she's pretty gritty from time to time, especially when she's up in the mix, as she usually tends to be. Jim Cassidy, your trainer, has done a really good job with her. So I've always been a fan of Yahila. I just think that with all the speed inside of her from post position 10, it's not really the best spot for her. Right. She could get hung 3 to 4 wide going into the first turn potentially, and that's not a particularly good spot, obviously, for her to be in. That what I said earlier about there being not much speed in the race. Forget I said that. There's a little more than I thought looking at the race on paper.
Well, see, that's why we do this. All right, I've got a few questions from some of the viewers. I'll use a moment to ask one of them right now because I think it's kind of germane to the whole discussion. Jason Landman wants to know, what would you define as elite pace figures with a positive pace variance? He's saying he's always wondered what was considered good.
Well, I mean, anytime when you're looking, for example, at the race shape, anytime you have a plus postscript there, it's going to be faster than par. Anytime you see a negative number, it's going to be slower than par. So when you get really up into the double digits, when you get like plus 10 or higher for the first call and the second call, especially the first call, you're really looking at a significantly faster than average pace for that final figure. When you're looking at the pace figure, the numerical pace figure itself, not the race shape, but how fast that particular horse ran pace figure-wise. This particular scale, the Moss pace figure scale, is based on 100 being pretty much top of the line. 100 would be the equivalent of a 120 Beyer speed figure. You will occasionally see horses for the first quarter mile get up into that realm, and maybe every now and then on a sloppy track when the jockeys really go all out to try to get early position, you might even see a higher than 100 pace figure, but it is extremely rare. And when you get up into the 90s, you're really running. So keep that in mind when you look at the pace numbers.
That's great. That's great info. And you did mention that it's related to the Beyer speed figure scale. Those of you who have not seen the webinar that we did with Randy, I think it was a month or two ago, that's archived at drf.com/YouTube. I wholeheartedly encourage everyone to watch it if you haven't had a chance. In it, Randy, you talked about how though the Beyer speed figures and your pace figures are not exactly one-to-one in terms of the number, they're on the same scale, and you kind of used it as an example of Celsius versus Kelvin. So think of it, because that's one of the questions that as a user, a formulator, and a promoter of your pace figures, people will always ask me, why isn't it exactly one-to-one to the Beyer speed figure?
Yeah, and we addressed that on the earlier webinar. Initially, I'll just give you the Cliff's Notes version quickly.
Sure.
You can check into the other webinar and get a more detailed explanation. When we first started the pace figures, they were designed initially, the way we looked at them, to be on the Beyer speed figure scale, so they would be exactly one-to-one. The problem is, especially in distance races, for the first quarter mile fractions and the first half mile fractions, they tend to be very slow on the Beyer scale, way into the negative numbers. Zenyatta would run -70, -80 on the Beyer scale for the first quarter mile of her races on synthetic. And the thought was, Andy Beyer's thought was that the negative numbers would get a little confusing for handicappers as they were trying to sort out the different pace figures. So he really didn't want the pace figures on the same exact scale as the Beyer figure. So what happens is the pace figures are calculated initially on the Beyer scale. As a matter of fact, when you go into our computer system that Andy uses and I use and all of the Beyer speed figure people use, and you go into the pace figure component, you actually see the Beyer figures in there. You see pace figures on the Beyer scale, but before they're published in DRF, they're then converted into the 1 to 100 scale that we use for the Moss pace figures, which will have no negative numbers to confuse anybody.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's jump. I'll switch over from Formulator to the Saturday card, and we'll start with, unless you want to talk about any of the undercard races, of which there are some interesting ones. We'll start with the third race on Saturday, which is the Juvenile Fillies. It's a 10-horse field, and at least from a Beyer speed figure standpoint, there's a horse that towers over this field. How do you see it shaking out from a pace standpoint?
Well, I think the heavily favored Songbird with Mike Smith towers over the field from just about any perspective that you would want to look at. I mean, she's shown the speed at Del Mar to be up on the early pace in a 44 4.5 mile going 7 furlongs. At the same time, she also showed last time out in the Chandelier that she was able to stretch her speed comfortably over 2 turns. So, there's really not anything in the race from a pace perspective. Forever Darling showed a little sprint speed at Santa Anita. That horse is to her inside in post position number 5. Nickname showed a little speed in the Frazette on a sloppy racetrack, but that was on a 1-turn mile. Although it was a pretty fast pace, as you sometimes get on sloppy surfaces, I mentioned before, you get the riders much more focused on early position to try to avoid slop getting kicked back in their face. But I think if you go back to Songbird's very first start, her maiden special weight at Del Mar going 3/4 of a mile, you get to see, what she's capable of running from a speed perspective. And she doesn't necessarily have to be in front, even though she's been in front in all of her races. That doesn't necessarily mean that she has to be in front. So I think she's easily the horse to beat, despite the far outside post position, whether she's on the early lead, as I think she probably will be, or whether she has to stalk.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of with you, and at a short price, she's the one I'd lean most heavily on. I'm just a touch concerned about the 10 post for her, but I think she's good enough, and from a speed standpoint and class standpoint, towers over the field. So, it's just we were talking on the DRF Players podcast. Matt Bernier was suggesting he maybe fly a plane over Keeneland to remind everybody that Rachel's Valentina is Rachel Alexandra's daughter, just to take a little bit more money off of Songbird.
The 2 races on Saturday that I think, throwing out the Classic, which we can get to as well, but the 2 other races on the undercard, so to speak, that I think are the most interesting from a pace perspective are the 2 sprints, the Filly and Mare sprint, and then the Breeders' Cup sprint for the males. When you go to the 5th race, the Filly and Mare sprint, one thing that just jumps out, both looking at the past performances and looking at the pace figures, is the abundance of early speed that you find in this race. Terrace, last time out in that race, the LA Woman got involved in a huge early speed duel at Santa Anita going 6.5 furlongs. 21-1 for the first quarter. When I gave you an example of pace figures that can occasionally at times reach the 100 mark, all you got to do is look at Terrace. In the LA Woman, her quarter was 100 and her half was 101. There was no way that she was going to win, even as a 3-5 favorite, in a speed duel 4 wide in that kind of position. So you've got to give Terrace extra credit on the surface looking at that going forward, except the caveat is when you look at this particular field and you look at all the other speed in it, Terrace is going to be involved than likely in another hot pace battle. There's La Verdad, who's almost always on the early lead. Stone-tastic last race at Parks.
Mm-hmm.
She had a 99 for her first quarter mile pace figure, and she also did that at Keeneland back in the Thoroughbred Club of America last fall. So she's capable of running exceptionally fast early. So looking at all the speed in here, this is what pace figures can do to show that not only do you have a handful of horses who are capable of running 90s, mid-90s, the first quarter and half mile, but you don't see horses that can typically run that fast and survive, which is going to be a little different when we look at the male sprint. But when you look at the female sprint, you can almost project a suicidal early duel that really works to the disadvantage of the horses in it. And so you start looking for horses excuse me, that have enough tactical speed to stay within contact, but yet can finish very well and earn strong final buyer speed figures. And the perfect example of that, I think, is going to be one of the best plays in all the Breeders' Cup races, and that's cavorting from post position 14. The post doesn't bother me at all going 7 furlongs. I would rather have cavorting in the 14 hole than the 1 hole, to tell you the truth. She's fast enough, as she showed in the Prioress at Saratoga, over 3/4 of a mile, to get early pace figures of 86 and 88, which doesn't put her out the back end of the race at all. And it's going to set up for her. I mean, there are going to be horses that are going to be flying at the end. Cavorting is going to be one of those. I wouldn't be surprised to see the defending champ, Judy the Beauty, as hard-knocking as she is, really put in a nice run from off the pace as well. But I really do think that the pace figures show that cavorting is in a really good spot here. She's 3-1 on the program line. No idea. I don't really have a good feel for if she's likely to go lower than that. Maybe post 14 will scare some people off, but I think she's a strong play.
Yeah, I am thinking along the same lines as you, especially at 7 furlongs. It's really, really difficult to carry that blazing speed from wire to wire. And even if you look through some of those horses that you mentioned, Stone-tastic, La Verdad, their best distance is a little bit shorter than that 7 furlong distance. And more and more of those races set up, especially if you've got this many front runners lined up, for a horse like cavorting who can run from off the pace, or even my crazy long shot in the race, coming off of nearly a year layoff, having last ran in this race last year for Mike Hush and Artemis Agritera, who couldn't you make a case, if you draw a line through the last race and make a case that she's ready off of this long layoff, working bullets up at Belmont? Her running lines look very similar in some ways to cavorting.
The layoff doesn't really bother me too much. In sprint races, it's not really that uncommon to see horses come off long layoffs that are well trained and run exceptionally well. I think Secret Circle did it, not necessarily in the Breeders' Cup, but you see that quite often. It's a completely different animal to get a horse ready off a long layoff in a sprint race, especially for a come from behinder. Right. And it is in longer races. Now, Artemis Agritera has shown speed in some of her races, but you draw a line through the last race in the Breeders' Cup last year where she was obviously compromised, and you look at her race before last. I've moved on my screen. I think it was at the Gallant Bloom.
Yes, exactly. The Gallant Bloom,
where she was far back in the pack and came flying to finish exceptionally well. You can look at that as kind of a blueprint for what the strategy would be like on Saturday.
That is exactly my thinking at 20-1. She ran down La Verdad, and she was 2-5 against La Verdad that day, and came in as the 9-2 choice, third choice in the Breeders' Cup Sprint last year. If you get 20-1 on the morning line, anything close to that, I think she's sneaky at a big price.
All right, now move ahead to the other horse that I think is one of the best plays on the whole two-day Breeders' Cup card. That would be in the 7th race in the regular Breeders' Cup Sprint. And what I'm talking about here is an example of one that is capable, unlike some of the ones we saw in the Filly Mare Sprint, that's capable of running an extremely taxing early pace and yet capable of shrugging it off and finishing well despite the fractions, which in the past has been pretty much a necessity for winning the Breeders' Cup Sprint more years than not. And by that, I'm talking about the 5-horse Run Happy, who in my opinion is just an absolute freak. I mean, this horse is an exceptional racehorse. Has the potential to be one of the best sprinters that we've seen come around in a long time. And when you look at his last race, Phoenix, it's even more impressive when you go between the lines a little bit. Okay, you had a sloppy racetrack, and you had Run Happy breaking from post position number 1. So the object was to keep Run Happy happy, to keep him from getting slop kicked in his face, and from the 1 post to get him out there early, even against horses like Work All Week, who's the defending champ in the Breeders' Cup Sprint, who was a extremely fast horse himself early. The problem was when the gates opened, Run Happy didn't break especially quickly. In fact, I think he was last away from the gate. So you go back and watch the replay. Edgar Prado absolutely sent him as hard as you can send a horse without resorting to the whip. Harder than Victor Espinosa sent American Pharaoh in the Preakness for the first quarter of a mile. And as a result, he goes the first quarter in a pace figure on a sloppy track now, so it's a little bit inflated, but 109. Then the half in 101, and despite that, and then despite the saddle slipping up, he winds up winning anyway. He winds up winning by a length and 3/4, gets a final buyer of 104, coming off the 113 that he got in the King's Bishop. And this horse is just a freak. I mean, you look at the workouts that he's had leading up to this race. The only knock that you can have on him, I think, is that sometimes his first couple of jumps out of the gate are not the fastest. He tends not to break exceptionally well. And if he gets into a situation where the hole closes up in front of him because he doesn't break exceptionally well, and he's forced to sit behind horses, that could be a bit of an issue. He might actually run over the top of them if that happens. But this horse is so quick to get back on his feet after a sluggish start that typically that hasn't been a problem. I mean, you look at the allowance race at Indiana Downs on July the 7th, you see he broke last out of 8. He was on a clear lead after the first quarter of a mile. King's Bishop, same thing. The Phoenix last time, same thing. And, so this horse is just so fast that he's capable of overcoming a lot. If you want to have fun, if you have access to Twin Spires or to the DRF video on Formulator would be perfect. You call up Run Happy's past performances on Formulator. You go to his career debut.
Right.
August or December 28th at Turfway Park. Go to the far right. Awkward start, green, veered. Click on that to watch the video of Run Happy's career debut on Polytrack at Turfway Park, and I promise you it's worth it. Yeah. It's one of the most unbelievable races you'll ever see. For a maiden special weight race on a cold December day at Turfway Park, it's amazing to watch this horse run in that race, especially going down the backside. 3-1 on the program line. I really was hoping that, and I still hope, that Private Zone will get a lot of action. I was disappointed on multiple levels in the injury to Todd Plischer's horse, Rockfall. So hoping to get 3-1 on Run Happy, and I think that would be a generous prize if we get it.
Yeah, and it's funny, all those things that you mentioned, and on the DRF Players podcast, I called his Phoenix a disaster, but he won anyway. He, as you mentioned, broke slow. Rarely do you see a horse break slow, rush up on the rail to take the lead against good horses and still win. I mean, that's almost always a suicide mission, yet he did it and dueled and put away the Breeders' Cup winner last year and the champion sprinter last year in work all week and held off the closers, all while the saddle was slipping, as you mentioned. So, yeah, for it to be such a disaster and for him to still win by open lengths, yeah, you mentioned the word freak. I think that's probably a good description for him. The only concern, of course, is like you mentioned, if he breaks slow against this group, could he be at a disadvantage? But he may be good enough to just overcome any of that.
And it's not a stellar year for American dirt sprinters. You know, I mean, you don't see. I mean, Private Zone's a nice horse, obviously. I mean, he's made $2.6 million, but he's now a 6-year-old, and his numbers this year have been just a tick or two slower, you know, than his numbers were as a 5-year-old. The Forego was pretty impressive last time, but he was cruising on a very easy early lead and slower than par pace figures. You know, I mean, he's a nice horse, and you got to expect him to run well. Although he didn't run well in the Breeders' Cup Sprint last. Well, he ran third. He ran pretty well. It was the year before. It was 2013 at Santa Anita when he was up dueling for the lead 21-1 and faded badly against Secret Circle. But with all respect to Private Zone, I just think at this point, Run Happy's a more talented horse.
I would agree, and especially at 6 furlongs. I think Run Happy might be better at that distance, and Private Zone might want just a touch further to carry that speed. All right, well, let's continue to move through the Breeders' Cup card. You know, we've passed over some of the turf races. Are there any, and we've had some questions from some of the viewers about some of the expected pace in some of the turf races. I know you don't have pace figures for any of them, but did you want to discuss any of the turf races before we jump to the BC Juvenile?
Well, there are very interesting pace scenarios in both of the major turf races on Saturday. In the Breeders' Cup Mile, you've got Obviously, who's one of the fastest, from a pace perspective, one of the fastest American milers on grass that we've had for the last, 3 years running. He's an extremely fast horse who is actually, I think, set up to run a little bit better in the Breeders' Cup Mile this year than he has the last few years. His typical modus operandi is to run really well in the late spring, early summer in races like the Shoemaker Mile in California and, maybe some of the races at Del Mar. And then when he gets into the fall, he's starting to tail off just a little bit. And then in the Breeders' Cup, he sets a fast pace and he fades to run 5th or 6th. Last year, they started him a little bit later in the year, and it seemed to help his performance a bit when he got to the Breeders' Cup. And now this year, they backed him up even further. So the object is to try to get Obviously to peak in the Breeders' Cup Mile. I don't know if we're going to see that, but from a pace perspective, it certainly does. It certainly does make it interesting because you're going to have Obviously winging on the front end. You're going to have the filly Tepin probably right behind him, and then you're going to have Tourist, trained by Bill Mott, who was compromised by an outside post, badly compromised last time in the Shadwell Turf Mile, and nearly won the race anyway, in what I thought was a gigantic performance. You're going to have Tourist right with Tepin chasing, Obviously. And then the Europeans, some very good Europeans. Make Believe, I think, is probably the best of the Europeans. But I think from a pace perspective, Tepin and Tourist are really good plays, especially Tourist, if he's a nice price, to take against the Europeans in the mile, even though Make Believe is a very good horse. One thing you have to keep in mind when you're handicapping these turf races here at Keeneland, the course was a little bit soft going into this week. Then we've got rain today. The remnants of Hurricane Patricia have floated up here. We're supposed to have rain all day tomorrow. The turf course is going to be really soggy. It's going to be yielding or soft on Friday and Saturday for the Breeders' Cup. And most people look at the races on turf and they say, well, this helps the Europeans because the Europeans are more accustomed to running on softer surfaces than the Americans are. But in reality, it doesn't really work that way. It typically works to the disadvantage of the European horses here. And the reason why is because the Europeans typically hand-pick the horses to bring to America that love firm turf, because the courses here are typically so much firmer. So they come over here and they want to see very, very firm turf. They don't want it to rain. They don't want soft turf. They're singing the blues over here right now because of all the rain and worried about how their horses are going to handle it. So Tepin is a horse that ran very well at Keeneland last time out on a yielding course. That's the best race of her career. It was a very, very, very good race. And, you know, just an hour later, Tourist ran almost as well in a losing effort in the Shadwell. So both of those horses back at Keeneland on soft footing, I think have a great chance from a pace perspective. They'll get good trips. Then quickly, I won't be as long on this one. In the Breeders' Cup turf, you've got the Rabbit. You've got Shining Copper in there who will be setting the pace for Big Blue Kitten. And he'll be opening up 5, 6, 7 lengths. And from a pace perspective, even though, you know, we don't do buyer pace figures for turf, in my opinion, I think the one horse this compromises more than any other in the race is Todd Pletcher's horse, Red Rifle. When you look at Red Rifle on paper, from a pace perspective, and you see him in 1.5 mile races, he typically has run pretty well when he's had very manageable paces, the kind of paces you would expect to see at 1.5 miles on turf. Your 48s, 49s for the half, 113, 114 for 6 furlongs. He's been up near the front or on the lead in those races. And at that pace and distributing his energy that evenly, he's been able to finish well and run some big numbers. Last time, when he ran up against Big Blue Kitten and the Rabbit, Shining Copper, he was dragged along into a faster pace than he likes. And as a result, Red Rifle didn't run nearly as well with the exertion that he had to have early in that race. Now the Rabbit's back in for the turf, and I think more than anything, it's going to hurt Red Rifle's chances. One other thing it's going to do, when you have a Rabbit like that, it tends to stretch out the field a little bit. It tends to spread them out. Normally in turf racing, the field's very bunched, and you see horses very close together because the paces aren't fast. But in this race, you're going to see them really spread out just because Shining Copper is going to be dragging the pace along so fast. That's going to help a horse like Golden Horn, the heavy favorite, from the number 1 post position, which ordinarily might be a bit of a problem. I know Frankie Dettori's a little bit concerned about it, he told us, from a traffic perspective. But I think he's going to have plenty of opportunity to get out from the number 1 spot, given how stretched out the race is going to be because of the Rabbit.
All right, I know there. You mentioned the softer going, even though he's won on soft ground overseas. I know that is a little bit of a concern for their camp as well. They were hoping, like you said, to get something a little firmer than what they normally would see in Europe. And he's going to be a very short price. Do you think he is beatable at 4 to 5 on the morning line? Probably something similar around that, or do you think he's just the best horse in the field, and you can envision a scenario where he loses, but it's probably not the most likely one?
I think he is almost certainly the best horse in the field anyway when he gets a soft course. He won on soft footing in the Irish Champion Stakes at Leopardstown race before last, and it was a very soft course. I mean, arguably the best horse in the world went 1.25 miles in 2:05 and 2, which tells you exactly, you know, how slow the footing was. And even when you go back at Sandown to see good to firm, 1.25 miles there was 2:05 and 3. You know, so he's run on courses that weren't as firm as he caught last time in the Arc de Triomphe. But here's the thing, is he as good on a soft course as he would be on firm footing? I think he's probably not. And so if he is, like you say, if you use that scenario, if he's 4 to 5, I mean, even though there are no main sequences in this field or anything like that, at that price, you've got to take a shot against Golden Horn on a soft course, either with, you know, a horse like the Pizza Man, who had a great prep at Keeneland in the Shadwell Mile, much shorter at a mile than he really would prefer, on a yielding course similar to the one he's going to see Saturday, and he came absolutely flying in the last quarter of a mile. To me, he would be the best price play against Golden Horn, given the way he ran on the Keeneland course under similar circumstances. Yeah,
I'm thinking along those same lines. It's those two for me, and then maybe a little bit of some of the others just more defensively. But I like the way you're thinking, Randy. Hope you're right. All right, let's jump on to the main event now, the 11th race on Saturday, the Breeders' Cup Classic. Of course, American Pharoah drew the post 4, and with Liam's Map's defection to the Dirt Mile, I think most people, and your figures certainly tell this story as well, most people think American Pharoah is just simply the fastest horse early and likely will get a comfortable early lead. Do you think he's at all vulnerable late, or does he get a good lead and then improve his position?
Well, the absence of Liam's Map really changed the complexion of this race in a very, very significant way. If Liam's Map had run in the race, regardless of what the post position draws were, there is no way that Victor Espinosa would have wanted to put American Pharoah in the position of going out early and hooking Liam's Map. There would have been a question whether Liam's Map could get 1.25 miles as effectively as he got 1.8 miles. And American Pharoah had shown that he can stalk effectively. Obviously, the Haskell was probably the best race of his career when he was sitting second behind a lone pace setter. So that's what Espinosa would have wanted to do with Liam's Map in the race. Now, we all know how good Liam's Map is when he's allowed to get a clear early lead. So the challenge then for American Pharoah would have been, he would have had to go up after Liam's Map, probably early on the second turn. And if he was able to put Liam's Map away, then Beholder would be on top of him. And if he was able to keep Beholder at bay, then he was going to have to hold off Honolist and Honor Code and maybe Keen Eyes and Frosted and some of those other horses charging from the back of the pack. That would have been a very tall order for American Pharoah to put that many horses away in that kind of a pace scenario. But now that Liam's Map is out, American Pharoah will be able to cruise on the kind of early lead that he had in the Belmont Stakes, relatively uncontested, that he had in the Travers Stakes until Frosted ran up and got him, which is a very unlikely scenario in the Breeders' Cup Classic. So I think the pace scenario is that American Pharoah cruises on an uncontested early lead with Beholder sitting right behind him, length and a half, 2 lengths behind. Gary Stevens confident in Beholder that she can go get American Pharoah when he wants her to, not wanting to go head-to-head with American Pharoah and hurt her chances. Mm-hmm. And then from that point, it just becomes, who the best horse is between the two. I think American Pharoah's Haskell was an almost identical performance to Beholder's Pacific Classic. I think it was virtually the same race. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes fascinating to me to see if American Pharoah runs his Haskell performance back again, and if Beholder runs her Pacific Classic back again, who's the best between those two? And if American Pharoah's not at his absolute level best and Beholder is not as good outside of California, then it obviously opens it up to all the other horses in the race that in one of the deepest classic fields we've seen in a long time. I think if you put a percentage chance on every horse in the race, what percentage chance do they have of winning? Then American Pharoah would have the higher percentage chance of winning, primarily because he's going to be the controlling speed. But there are a couple of factors here, I think, that make American Pharoah, even in that situation, a bet against. Number one, obviously, is going to be the public sentiment. He's 6-5 in the morning line. Mike Battaglia made him expecting the public to jump all over him almost from a rooting interest standpoint. And I have a sneaking suspicion that on Breeders' Cup Saturday, he might even go lower than 6-5. I don't think that's commiserate with his chances to win, right? I would put his chances to win at about 8-5 or 9-5. Also keep in mind that the Keeneland racing surface is not the Keeneland dirt racing surface of old, not by a long shot. When people think of Keeneland dirt, some handicappers might think of the old conveyor belt, inside speed biased racing surface that Keeneland used to have, in which case American Pharoah would deserve to be 4-5. This Keeneland dirt surface is among the least speed favoring of any dirt surfaces in America that I've seen. It is a very, very honest surface. So while American Pharoah will be helped from a tactical standpoint, not having any challenges early, he's not going to get any help from the track surface like he would have gotten, let's say, if this race were run at Santa Anita.
Right.
So I think for those two reasons, value and the surface that he's running over, I think he's a bet against. I really do.
Right. So let me ask you this. You say you think he's on the lead early. Who do you envision as the first one to take a shot at him, maybe either on the backstretch or around the turn? Is it a Beholder, or is it maybe Smooth Roller, or maybe someone who shows some early speed that we aren't necessarily expecting?
All right. Well, when you look at the pace figures and you look at Smooth Roller, one thing that immediately jumps off the page is that he is not as fast as you would think looking at the past performances at face value. The pace in the Awesome Again, which incidentally was set by Bayern, was very slow. -15 on the race shape. For horses of that caliber, they were sleepwalking out there on the front end. And you look at Smooth Roller's race before that in the Brubaker at a mile at Del Mar, and he stumbled at the start, so you can't really get a good feel of that. Before that, an allowance race at Del Mar, 72, 74. Yeah, he's got some tactical speed, but I don't think he's as fast as Beholder. So I think it's going to be Beholder that's going to be taking the first crack at American Pharoah. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when she does launch that kick. I personally think that the way American Pharoah ran in the Travers when he was pushed so hard in that middle half mile by Frosted and still nearly won the race. But when you break it down fractionally, and you look at Beholder's race in the Pacific Classic from a fractional perspective, I don't think she's going to be able to get to American Pharoah on the turn. I think, and Jerry Bailey and I, my broadcast colleague, delved into this in great detail yesterday analyzing this race. We both are of the opinion that if she's going to beat American Pharoah, it's probably going to be in the last eighth of a mile because the gigantic move that she made that was so impressive visually in the Pacific Classic was a function of A, her ability, obviously, but B, the fact that the horses around her were essentially shifting into reverse. It was not a good bunch of horses she was running against at the Pacific Classic. And she actually, from a fractional pace perspective, was running fairly evenly, but visually it was an optical illusion. The horses around her weren't going anywhere, and it made her look like she was just rocketing forward. American Pharoah is going to be a completely different animal in front of her. So I think she'll make a run at him. Don't think she'll be able to get by him on the turn. If she runs her race, she'll still be making a run at him as they come through the lane. And if she's going to beat him, I think that's where it's going to be in that last 3/16 of a mile, that last eighth of a mile.
So you see those two running at least through the mid-stretch and maybe even late stretch as 1-2. Do you think that puts any of the deep closers like a Tonalist, an Honor Code, maybe up against it from a pace dynamic standpoint?
From a pace standpoint, it definitely puts them at somewhat of a disadvantage because the pace is not going to be as fast, for example, as Tonalist and Honor Code got in the Whitney, which I think is the race that most people look at to, to say, wow, Honor Code is a horse that is a horse I really like in the Breeders' Cup Classic. You obviously can't look at the Kelso and say, boy, I love Honor Code, and you can't look at the Ali Sheba and say, oh, yeah, Honor Code. So you either look at the Metropolitan or you look at the Whitney. And in the Whitney, with Liam's map out there, absolutely speedballing it on the front end through very fast early fractions. That race set up for a horse like Honor Code and for Tonalist to come from as far back in the pack as they were. I mean, Tonalist was 18 lengths back at the second call, and Honor Code was even further back than that. Yeah, he was 19 lengths back. They're not going to get that kind of pace, which does not, on the surface, help their chances. But you're talking a mile and a quarter. You're also talking about a surface at Keeneland that's been very kind to come from behinders, even at shorter distances. So I think that, to a certain extent, mitigates the disadvantage that they'll have from the pace. And I don't think, even though American Pharoah is going to be setting the pace, it's going to be an uncontested pace, I don't think it's going to be as slow as some people think it might be. If you listen to Victor Espinosa's comments after the Travers, one thing he lamented was that he let American Pharoah go so slowly for the first half mile that he let Frosted up into the race. That he thought that from a tactical perspective, he should have used American Pharoah's speed a little bit more to open up on Frosted and maintain a little bit of a buffer and prevent Pharoah from getting into that eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with Frosted that he found himself locked into for the second half of that race. So I think he'll let American Pharoah roll a little bit during the first part of the Breeders' Cup Classic instead of just nursing him along in very slow fractions.
That's great information. Well, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. And Randy, we've hit just about an hour, so I really, really appreciate you taking this time to be on the webinar today. I'll also mention to everybody watching, you can sign up for the webinars we have for the rest of the week. We have 2 tomorrow and 2 Thursday. Just go to drf.com/webinars to see what's all available and to sign up. They're all free. They will all, just like this one, just like the one we had with Stephen Christ and Andrew Beyer earlier today, they will all be posted at DRF's YouTube channel, which is drf.com/YouTube. Randy, thank you so much for joining today, and best of luck in the Breeders' Cup.
Thanks. Take care.